I don't think that any of the four premises, including the two in the standard form, are established with like a high level of confidence or persuasively by Craig. Personally, I think it's very unlikely that time is tensed or that presentism is true in the way that Craig says. I think that we have very good evidence for thinking that that's false.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's true, then the Kalam is just already in a lot of trouble. At the very least, it needs to be reformulated in tenseless terms. And I personally think that you can't rescue the Kalam. You just have to use a different cosmological argument. But putting that to the side...
Well, actually, that's where I'm going to kind of have to disagree with you, because I think that, like I mentioned briefly before the show, we have different interpretations, I think, of the implications of things like the Grimm Reaper Paradox and how it relates to this. Because I do think that something like the Grimm Reaper Paradox does prevent an actual number of, an actual infinite amount of stuff from existing. So I think the only way to escape this problem is to have all possible possibilities loop in on itself in such a way where there is no begin to exist. Everything exists at all times. It just you pick from our perspective, we look back and we say that the Big Bang is as far back as we can go, because before that we can't do anything. We can't speculate much about that. But with something like the Grimm Reaper Paradox being out there, suggesting that infinite series of causal events can't exist unless you want to accept contradiction, I think that I have to accept that there can't be an infinite causal chain that goes backwards one after the other in that way. The only way to break the chain is to say that there is just a finite number of causes, but those causes just create a sort of loop, if you will.
Well, I think we're jumping ahead a little bit here, because I don't think any of that has direct bearing on the philosophy of time issue that I just mentioned. So that would be the Grimm Reaper Paradox would be relevant to the premise that the universe began to exist. And Craig actually doesn't use this as an argument that the universe began to exist. The reason for that is because the Grimm Reaper Paradox, which we should probably explain actually, but I'll just finish this point. The Grimm Reaper Paradox assumes that time can be divided up into infinitesimally small intervals. And Craig actually rejects that as a model of time. That's maybe something else we could talk about, how he thinks about time. And so that's not really going to work as an argument against the possibility of an actual infinite, because if you were like Craig, you'll just reject the idea that time can be divided up infinitesimally into arbitrarily small intervals. And so basically the assumption behind the Grimm Reaper Paradox just wouldn't follow there.
Well, that's actually the point, is that there can't be an infinite number. There must be a finite number, and at some point there just is a first Reaper. I mean,
yeah. So maybe we should explain the Grimm Reaper Paradox. Would you like to explain it, maybe, Caleb, since you brought it up?
Okay, so the Grimm Reaper Paradox is essentially goes like this. Let's imagine that Billy is standing in his bedroom at 10 o'clock, and at noon there's a Reaper that's going to kill him. However, unbeknownst to that Reaper, halfway between noon and 10 o'clock, at 11 o'clock that is, there's another Reaper.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's relevant. So at 11 o'clock is another Reaper that's going to kill that guy, if and only if he hasn't been killed already.
That guy meaning Billy?
Billy, I'm sorry, yes. So if and only if Billy hasn't been killed yet, the Reaper at 11 o'clock will kill Billy. However, unbeknownst to that Reaper, halfway between him and Billy is another Reaper. And he will kill Billy if and only if the Reaper before him hasn't killed Billy.
Okay.
Now, if there is an infinite series of Reapers, then there cannot be any one Reaper that can kill Billy, because there will always have been a Reaper prior to that one which hadn't yet killed him, and so on down the line ad infinitum. So you can say that he will never get killed, but you can also say that he could be killed. If you want to, I can't honestly remember.
I think I get it. I think I get how the analogy goes, but is this something? What I'm wondering is who came up with this and who thought it, besides you, who agrees with it. Who thought this
No
was
idea
a good
the history,
argument?
the thought on this one.
I believe Alexander Proust has recently published in defense of the Grimm Reaper argument, or the Grimm Reaper Paradox as an argument for causal finitism. As I said, Craig doesn't, he mentions it, but he doesn't use it as an argument for the finitude of the past. He actually uses it as an argument against the possibility of time having the structure of the real numbers. That is, it's infinitesimally divisible into arbitrarily small increments. This is what I was saying before. The Grimm Reaper Paradox assumes that you can do that because there's a Reaper that will appear at 12, but then there's another Reaper at 11:30, and there's another Reaper at 11:15, and so on. Not just infinitely many of them, but it's actually infinitely many and arbitrarily small increments of time. So if there was, say, a smallest unit of time, then the Grimm Reaper paradox, well, the Grimm Reaper situation wouldn't be applicable to temporal events, right? Because there wouldn't be any instant of time or unit of time sort of halfway in between. It's like there's no natural number between 0 and 1. So if you say, well, there's a Reaper that's going to appear between that, well, it's just, if time has that structure, wouldn't be metaphysically possible. And that's what Craig, to simplify, that's what Craig thinks. And therefore, he's just going to say the Grimm Reaper paradox is a paradox that shows that time cannot be infinitesimally divisible that way. But he doesn't actually use it as an argument for the finitude of the past. He uses different arguments for that. You see that there's a further problem that presentists have to address, which is called the extent of the present. So if you say that the present is all that exists, you then have to answer the question, what is present?
Mm-hmm.
And so there seem to be two options. Craig kind of creates a third one, but I don't think it makes any sense, and we'll see what you guys think. So the first option is that the present instant is what exists. So that would be basically the assumption behind the Grimm Reaper paradox, where you can sort of divide time arbitrarily up into arbitrarily infinitesimally small increments, just like you can on the real number line. You can just have as many decimals as you like, so to speak. That would be one possibility. But Craig rejects this possibility for a number of reasons. One is that he uses the Grimm Reaper paradox. Another reason Craig rejects it is because it would be inconsistent with his argument that no actual infinite is possible. Because, think about it this way, how many instants of time are there between, say, 11 a.m. and noon? Well, if time it consists of a series of infinitesimal moments, then there's infinitely many instants of time. And Craig has to reject that if he's to use his Hilbert's Hotel and similar arguments, which say that no actual infinity can exist. So for these reasons, Craig rejects the idea that time is comprised of instants. So then you might think, well, okay, he's got to say that time has the structure of the natural numbers. So it's like 0, 1, 2, but there's no like moments in between there. But Craig rejects this as well. He gives different reasons for this. He thinks that they're sort of paradoxes. And I think also another reason that he rejects this is because it seems to be a constraint on God's omniscience. So it would seem a bit odd to say that there's like 1 second, or it's not going to be a second, but like one moment of time, and then the next moment, and then the next moment, like the natural numbers. But Craig would want to say that God can just like have a thought in between those two instants of time, because surely God could create like a moment of time if he wanted to between like 0 and 1, for instance. So if Craig was to say that time has the structure of the natural numbers, then that means even God can't like have a thought between those two instants of time or moments of time. And I don't think Craig wants to say that. I mean, he could say that, but that seems to be a kind of a big restriction on God's power, right? So Craig gives that and some other arguments, so he has to reject that option.
If only this moment exists, then isn't God still bound by the fact that only this? Like, I don't understand how you could be sans time in a universe where everything exists only in one moment but continues to the next.
So Craig believes that God has two different modes of existence, a timeless and a temporal mode. Craig believes that, this is the wording that Craig used, sans the universe, or prior to, but it's not really prior to, it's just like without the universe, prior to creation, if you like, God existed timelessly. When God created the universe, like let there be light at moment t equals 0, God created the universe and thereby entered into time. So now God is temporal and he exists in time. Mm-hmm. So Craig rejects the two options that would seem most intuitive, right? That time consists of instants that can be arbitrarily small, and time consists of like discrete moments like, 0, 1, and 2. But if those two are rejected, what's left? Well, Craig adopts this position where he says, and I can't even say this without laughing because it's so silly in my opinion, time consists of a non-metrical or non-measurable interval which is centered at the present instant, but varies depending on what you refer to. So like it seems, I think it's a complete mess, right? But he seems to say that if you refer to like the present second, then the present second is what is present. But if you talk about like the present hour or the present day, then what is present gets larger, which would seem to imply that brings things into existence. Because remember, he says that to be present is simply to exist. And other people have pointed this out as well. It doesn't seem to make any sense at all, because it's like what exists is entirely relative to like what we talk about or think about or something. I've tried to make sense of this. I give quotes, right? You might think I'm straw manning. Look at my book. I talk about it. I show quotes. I don't think it makes any sense at all. I think that Craig is pushed to this position because he has to. Other commitments force him to reject the other two possibilities about what the present could be. So the reason I think that's relevant is because I don't think Craig can give a consistent and coherent philosophy of time to make sense of the Kalam. He's forced to presentism because of what he thinks about the beginning. He's forced away from instantaneous moments because of his like Hilbert's Hotel actual infinity arguments, and he's forced to reject time having the structure of the real numbers, like discrete moments, because that would seem to conflict with God's, omnipotence of being able to, create time whenever he wants to, sort of. So I don't think he's left with anything that makes sense. And so for this reason, I just reject Craig's philosophy of time. I think it's it's complete nonsense. I don't even think I don't just think it's wrong. I think it just doesn't make sense. It's incoherent.
Yeah, at best, I think my layman reinterpretation of this would be to say that the measurable difference from one moment to the next is completely arbitrary. It can be anything. It could under his model, and so to me that's my takeaway from that. And so it seems to be an ever expanding like epistemology, tautology, whatever, like just something that you can apply any mode you want to fill the gaps. Well, maybe not any mode, but several that I'm assuming work in his favor, because it just seems kind of like a cop out to me. But like you were saying, it's sleazy almost. I don't know. I don't like it, but I don't want to call it sleazy. I think he actually is trying to make this make sense, but it just has that vibe to me that is really forced.
Trying to make it make sense, but I think he knows. This is me psychologizing, but having read a lot of Craig and listened to a lot of it, I feel like I'm entitled to do that. People could disagree, of course, but I feel like he knows that there's a problem here. I think he thinks that he is right, but I think he also is aware at some level that he hasn't really worked out all the details here. I just don't know how he can take his own model of the present seriously. It just is completely ridiculous. The thing is, though, that no one calls him out on this. There are a couple of papers that have responded to his particular model of time, but really he only talks about this. And remember, I mentioned he's published some big academic, boring books about philosophy of time, and it's only a few philosophers who like read these and respond to them. He never talks about this in his popular debates or elsewhere. I've seen it really mentioned. And if he ever does mention philosophy of time generally, he'll just refer you to his books, which he knows. Again, this is me psychologizing. He knows that basically no one is going to read. I mean, they're hard to understand, right? They're very expensive, and they're difficult reads, right? So the point is, I think there's a deliberate level of sophistry here, where it's like he knows that there are at least problems with his philosophy of time, but he says, "Well, I've written about this, and there's plausible deniability there because the books are there, and he has defended it there." That doesn't mean it's a good defense, right? But he's able to distance himself away from it enough so that it never comes back to bite him in these debates.
Do you think that is him just being in a state of cognitive dissonance? Is he dishonest? Is he intentionally trying to avoid it because he knows it doesn't work? What's your take on that?
No, I think he thinks it works.
Now that we're psychologizing.
I don't think he's being deliberately dishonest in the sense that he thinks he's like lying to people. I think that he realizes there are problems. Look, this is what everyone does, right? You think you've sort of got it, but maybe you can't quite articulate, or there's this little problem or whatever. But you don't want to emphasize that, because you want to emphasize the point where you think that you've got right. And so you just kind of cover it up a little bit. I think people do this all the time with everything, right? There are issues, but you just sort of pave over it, and you don't want people to emphasize that. Now, Craig has explicitly said that the purpose of his apologetics is not like to get at truth or anything. It's to convince people to believe in Christ, and often more to the point, to stop people from leaving Christianity. So, and he's explicitly said in some cases that Christians should not, or most Christians at least, should not read atheist or other material, because they might be convinced by it. Like they might not be cognitively ready. They may not have the background necessary to see the problems in it, which of course there must be according to
He's
Craig.
actually said that in his books.
Yes, he has before. I don't have the citation on me, but I have
Wow.
I have seen it before. And if someone wants to pull me up on that, I'll provide a citation.
Well, I've heard him
if you're
say on
interested.
stage that, you know, like personal revelation is more than sufficient to believe in
Yeah, so
God Almighty.
That's why he believes, I do document this in the book, that he doesn't believe because of any of his arguments. In fact, he has said that even if all of his arguments were decisively refuted and powerful arguments were given in favor of atheism, he would still believe because of his personal experiences. So this is what the relevance of that is that he is very clear that the arguments aren't what convinces him or necessarily should convince other people, but they do have rhetorical force. And so that is his main motivation for developing them. I think it's fairly clear. So that is relevant, I think, for assessing like how he's reacting to problems with philosophy of time. He, I think, is quite happy to sweep some of those issues under the rug, even though he thinks that there's probably some solution, but he doesn't really want to make that a big deal because he wants to focus on the things that he can defend more easily and that are more persuasive.
Those don't sound like minor issues to me. Those sound like things that are fundamental to the entire system, and that if it's almost like a chain, where if you remove 2 or 3 pieces in the chain, you don't have a chain anymore, you know?
Yes, I agree.
The presentation of time is not in accordance with our understanding of time. Then
Well,
your whole
our
model
understanding,
falls
but like he had said, Craig didn't even think to question his understanding of time.
Mm-hmm. But it turns out it doesn't matter. But according to James, it doesn't matter, because if his position is that he's not convinced by those arguments, he's just using them as a hook to, I guess, keep Christians in Christianity, then they don't have to be perfect. They can be imperfect arguments, and that will work for someone who's already sort of indoctrinated. Well, I mean, I was struck by the way that James, when you mentioned that Craig, he's modified his arguments numerous times to the point where he's come up with a second formulation of the KCA. You said, I think a few moments ago, you said that his arguments have become more sophisticated in his apologetics for it.
Yes.
It almost sounds like these are just ad hoc ideas that he's creating to fill in the holes that people can find in the arguments that are existing. So he's just making up definitions of time, for example, that seem to work with his beliefs.
Oh, well, I think that is transparently what the purpose of his writings on time were. Again, I quote this in my book where he talks about this. He basically says, well, he's not quite as blunt about it as I am, but the content, the basis of it is still there. He's basically saying, look, I didn't quite have the time stuff worked out, so I wrote 4 big books about it, and now I've defended it there. But the thing that I think is clear is because of the commitments that he already has, he's already committed to God's omnipotence. He's already committed to the impossibility of an actual infinite existing, and he's already committed to the fact that the universe began to exist, right? So all of these things combine to mean that there are very few options for him in terms of what his philosophy of time has to look like. And in fact, I think it's impossible for him to give a coherent account. To be clear, I'm not saying here that Craig's philosophy of time is just wrong or like there's good arguments against it. I think it is incoherent. He can't even make it work. And again, I refer people to my book to get the details on that. But I think Craig, in order to save his argument, needs to give up something. I think personally what he should do is just say that what exists is the present instant, and give up this idea of a non-metrical interval or something like that. To do that, then he's going to have to give up the Hilbert's Hotel argument, because the Hilbert's Hotel says that an actual infinite is impossible, but it seems that if time is an instant, then there are an infinite number of instants between any, even in a second, there's an infinite number of instants there.
So
thanks, Andrew.
Let me pause it. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Finish your thought.
Well, just to finish that sentence. And so if he adopts that, then I think he's now got a philosophy of time that at least is coherent, but he's going to have to give up some of his other arguments for the Kalam.